There was a time when I believed that family meant unconditional support, no matter what. I was wrong, dead wrong. My name is Michael. I'm 52 years old, and this is the story of how my own family tried to financially destroy me, and how I fought back with nothing but the truth. I'd spent 30 years building a career in construction management. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. I'd put 3 kids through college, helped my sister pay for her house down payment, and when my aging parents needed care, I was the one who stepped up. I'd contributed more than my fair share to family emergencies, family celebrations, family everything. I thought that's what you did. That's what love meant to me. But love doesn't mean being a financial doormat. My brother-in-law David, he was always the charmer. Smooth talker, expensive suits, always talking about his investments and his connections. My sister Margaret believed every word. They lived beyond their means. I could see it from a mile away. The Range Rover, the vacation homes, the constant renovations. Somewhere along the line, they started borrowing money, small amounts at first, then bigger ones. And I stupidly kept giving, 20,000 here, 30,000 there. I told myself it was temporary, that they'd get back on their feet once David's business took off. But the money never went back to anyone but me, and the debt in my mind kept growing. I never formalized it. That was my mistake. I kept mental notes because I thought family didn't need contracts. Family needed trust. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd given them almost $200,000 over a decade, and they'd spent every penny. The breaking point came during my mother's funeral. It was supposed to be a day of grief and remembrance, but Margaret pulled me aside in the cemetery, of all places, and said they needed another $15,000 for some property dispute with the county. I looked at her standing there in her designer black dress, and something inside me just snapped. "No," I said simply, "no more." She stared at me like I'd spoken in a different language. My mother had just been buried, and I was saying no. The guilt trip started immediately, the disappointed looks, the comments to other family members about how cold I'd become, how I'd abandoned them in their time of need. They made it sound like I owed them my entire life. Then came the lawsuit. I got the papers on a Tuesday morning. Margaret and David were suing me for $187,000, claiming I'd promised them financial assistance as part of a family agreement, and that I'd deliberately breached that promise. The amount was calculated to include everything I'd given them, plus emotional damages. The lawyer they'd hired knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't about recovering money they'd lent me. This was about punishment. My own lawyer told me to settle. "It'll be cheaper," he said. "Family lawsuits are messy. Just pay them what they're asking for and move on." But I'd spent years watching them ignore my repeated requests for repayment. I'd watched David buy a boat while claiming he had no money to return mine. I'd watched Margaret post pictures of luxury vacations on Instagram while telling me she couldn't afford her electric bill. I'd watched them lie, spend, and manipulate, and then claim victimhood when consequences finally arrived. I decided to fight. For 3 months, I gathered every single piece of evidence, every bank transfer, every text message, every email I'd sent asking about repayment dates, every photograph of receipts from purchases they'd made with my money. I created a timeline that showed the exact pattern of requests, the exact amounts, and the exact promises they'd made to repay me. Promises that never materialized. I worked late into the nights, organizing folders, creating spreadsheets, documenting everything with dates and amounts. My hands shook as I scrolled through years of messages, seeing in writing how I'd gradually become their personal ATM. How I'd excused their behavior over and over, how I'd prioritized their comfort over my own financial security. The night before the court date, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my father, who'd passed away years earlier. He'd always told me that a man's word and his actions defined his character. He taught me the difference between helping and enabling. Somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that lesson. Tomorrow, I was going to remember it. The courthouse was cold and sterile. I sat in the waiting area with folders organized by year, by transaction type, by communication method. Margaret and David sat across the room with their lawyer, who kept whispering to them and adjusting his briefcase like he'd already won. They looked confident, smug even. Why wouldn't they? In their minds, I was the family member who'd abandoned them. I was the villain. I was the one with something to prove. When we entered the courtroom, the judge was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She read the complaint aloud, and I watched her expression as she got to the part about $187,000 in promised financial assistance. Her eyebrows went up slightly. She'd clearly seen plenty of family disputes, and she probably could already tell this one was about more than money. Their lawyer went first. He presented the argument that I'd made a family commitment to support their investments and lifestyle, that this was an established pattern and that my sudden refusal constituted a breach of trust and contract. He painted a picture of a wealthy older brother who'd simply gotten tired of sharing his abundance. He used words like selfish, abandonment, and betrayal. I watched the judge's face to see if she was buying it. She wasn't visibly reacting, which actually worried me more. Then it was my turn. I stood up and took a breath. I had prepared a statement, but looking at the judge, I decided to just speak from the heart instead. I told her I'd come to court with documentation of every single transaction, every single communication, and every single broken promise. I told her I was bringing receipts, literally and figuratively. I opened my folders, slowly, methodically, bank statements showing deposits I'd made to their accounts, text messages where David had promised to repay me within 6 months, messages from 7 years ago, emails where Margaret had specifically requested money as a loan that we'll pay back by next spring, from a spring that never came. Photographs of receipts for purchases they'd made with my money, the boat slip, the vacation resort charges, the high-end restaurant bills. As I laid each piece of evidence on the judge's desk, I watched Margaret's face go pale. David kept whispering frantically to his lawyer. Their lawyer's confident demeanor started to crack. He'd probably been counting on me showing up emotional, unprepared, or too guilt-ridden to fight back. I wasn't any of those things. I was methodical. I was calm. And I was right. I continued methodically through the documentation. The judge put on her reading glasses and began reviewing each piece of evidence, her expression growing colder with every page. I could see the moment realization hit her. This wasn't a situation of broken promises. This was a situation of deliberate financial exploitation covered by emotional manipulation. I spoke directly to the court. Your Honor, I want to be clear about something. I have never refused to help my family. What I have done is refused to be used. Every dollar I gave was given out of love, with the expectation that these were loans that would be repaid. I never demanded immediate repayment. I never charged interest. I wanted to help them build their lives, but instead they built a narrative where my generosity became my obligation and my boundaries became my betrayal. I showed her the text message chain where Margaret had explicitly asked for $35,000 for their son's medical emergency, an emergency that, after investigation, had never existed. The money had gone to renovate their kitchen. I showed her the email where David had promised to repay $40,000 by a specific date, with the exact words, "Consider this a solemn promise, brother-in-law. You have my word." That email was dated 12 years ago. The money had never been returned. I showed her a photograph of their Instagram posts from a luxury resort in Cancun, posted the same week Margaret had called me in tears saying she couldn't afford her car payment, a car I'd helped pay for. The judge put down her glasses and looked at David and Margaret directly. "These are extraordinary claims," she said quietly. "To sue someone for $187,000 based on a family agreement while having no written contract, no formal acknowledgement of debt, and no documented promises of repayment. Meanwhile, the defendant has provided extensive documentation of explicit promises to repay, multiple communications requesting the funds as loans, and clear evidence of financial irresponsibility on your part. She turned to their lawyer. I'm assuming you knew about this documentation. He shifted uncomfortably. We believed the emotional context. The emotional context, the judge interrupted, does not override documented facts. Do you have any written evidence of a formal agreement that Mr. Michael was obligated to provide $187,000? Silence. Any promissory notes? Any contracts? Any acknowledgement by the defendant that he was giving this money as anything other than loans? Their lawyer shook his head. The judge looked at me. Mr. Michael, do you have written evidence of these being presented as loans? I nodded and handed her printouts of 6 separate messages where Margaret had used the word loan, where David had promised repayment. I had screenshots, I had emails, I had receipts from the transactions themselves with notes explaining what they were for. I watched Margaret's jaw tighten. David suddenly became very interested in his shoes. The judge reviewed everything slowly, deliberately. I could see her building the framework of her decision as she read. When she finally looked up, her expression was severe. This court finds that there is insufficient evidence of any formal agreement or contract that would obligate Mr. Michael to provide financial support to the plaintiffs. Furthermore, the extensive documentation provided by the defendant clearly establishes that these were presented and accepted as loans. The plaintiffs have provided no evidence of repayment attempts, no documentation of their own, and no written agreements supporting their claims. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. What I do see is a pattern of financial requests presented as temporary urgent needs, emergency situations that, based on the defendant's documentation, were not emergencies. I see promises to repay that were never fulfilled. I see individuals who appear to have treated the defendant's generosity as an endless resource rather than finite assistance. And now, rather than acknowledging this dynamic or attempting repayment, they're suing for the full amount as if it were compensation they were owed. She turned to face Margaret and David directly. That's not how family works. And it's certainly not how the law works. The gavel came down. The case is dismissed. The plaintiff's lawsuit is without merit. Furthermore, I'm ordering the plaintiffs to pay the defendant's court costs and legal fees. The amount she specified was $18,000. Not everything, but significant. Margaret made a sound like a wounded animal. David's face turned red. Their lawyer immediately started whispering urgent instructions, but they both looked like they'd been struck by lightning. They'd walked into that courtroom absolutely certain they would win. They'd believed their own narrative so completely that they hadn't considered the possibility that documented truth would matter more than their performance of victimhood. I remained perfectly still, allowing myself one quiet breath of relief. As we left the courtroom, I overheard Margaret telling their lawyer that they'd appeal everything and that I'd betrayed the family. Even in absolute defeat, even with every lie exposed and every manipulation documented, she couldn't acknowledge what had actually happened. She couldn't see her own role in the destruction of the relationship. In her mind, I was still the villain. That's when I truly understood something crucial. Some people don't want to change. They don't want to take responsibility. They don't want to face the reality of their own choices. They want to stay victims forever because victimhood absolves them of accountability, and I could no longer set my life on fire trying to convince them otherwise. Walking to my truck in the parking lot, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not sadness, not guilt. I felt peace. I'd done something that terrified me. I'd said no to family. I'd set a boundary that cost me relationships. I'd valued truth over comfort, and I'd stood alone in court with nothing but documented reality to defend myself, and I'd won. But the real victory wasn't about the money or the court decision. The real victory was about reclaiming my life from the narrative that had been written for me. I wasn't the villain who'd abandoned his family. I was a man who'd loved too freely and set a boundary too late. But I'd finally set it. 3 weeks later, Margaret sent me a text message. It was brief. "We need to talk about family reconciliation." I read it twice, then I deleted it. Some bridges, once burned, shouldn't be rebuilt. Some relationships, once poisoned by manipulation and entitlement, can't be salvaged. And some people need to learn that every action has a consequence, that you can't spend your way through life leaving emotional and financial wreckage behind you and expect everyone to smile and absorb the damage. I'd spent 30 years being the family's safety net. It had cost me my savings, my peace of mind, and my sense of self. But walking out of that courthouse, I finally understood. Being a good man doesn't mean being endlessly exploited. Setting boundaries doesn't make you cold. And choosing yourself doesn't make you selfish. It makes you free. 3 months passed. The court victory should have felt complete, but I realized something devastating. Winning in court doesn't automatically heal what was broken. The legal battle was over, but the emotional one was just beginning. I'd spent 3 decades pouring my life into relationships that were fundamentally one-sided, and now I had to confront the emptiness that followed when those relationships finally ended. I started seeing a therapist. Her name was Dr. Patterson, and she was the first person in my life who helped me understand the difference between love and obligation. We met every Wednesday evening, and slowly I began to untangle the patterns that had defined my life. I realized that my father's death when I was in my 30s had left a void I'd been trying to fill by becoming the provider, the problem solver, the emotional anchor for everyone around me. I'd confused self-sacrifice with love. I'd confused enabling with loyalty. "You've been running from your own grief," Dr. Patterson told me one evening. "Instead of processing your father's death, you became him. You became the man who provided, the man who was always there, the man who never said no. But Michael, you're not your father. You're allowed to be a man who has limits." That hit me hard. I started reconnecting with people I'd neglected for years. My oldest son, James, who'd barely spoken to me during the lawsuit because he felt torn between loyalty to his mother and loyalty to me. He'd watched the family drama unfold and felt responsible for keeping the peace. When I called him and apologized for not shielding him from all of it, he broke down on the phone. "Dad, I never blamed you," he said. "I blamed them for putting you in that position. I watched you give everything, and I watched them take it without shame. I was angry at them, not at you." Hearing that shifted something in me. I hadn't destroyed my relationship with my son. The toxic family dynamics had already done that. What I'd actually done was refuse to participate in the destruction anymore. We started having dinner together regularly, real conversations, not catching up on years of awkward distance, but actually rebuilding something real. He told me about his girlfriend, about his job, about his dreams, and I listened without trying to fix everything or throw money at problems. I just listened. My daughter Rachel was more complicated. She'd sided with Margaret emotionally, even though she believed I was right legally. She called me a month after the court decision and asked to meet for coffee. I was nervous. I didn't know what she wanted or if reconciliation was possible. We met at a small cafe near my office, and for the first few minutes, neither of us said much. "I owe you an apology," she finally said. "I believed what Aunt Margaret told me. I thought you were being selfish and cold, but then I started asking her specific questions about the money, about the promises to repay, and she got angry. She wouldn't answer directly. She just kept saying that family is supposed to help each other unconditionally, but Dad, you did help them unconditionally. You gave them $187,000. How much more were they expecting? I didn't have an answer to that question, so I asked her instead. How much is enough? At what point does unconditional help become conditional exploitation? She stared into her coffee cup for a long time. I don't know. I don't think I understood that question until now. We rebuilt our relationship slowly, not perfectly. There were still moments of tension, but with genuine effort. She started asking me about my life, my interests, things I'd sacrificed for years in pursuit of being everyone else's solution. But there was one family member who didn't reach out. My youngest son, Thomas, who'd been closest to David before all of this. Thomas had believed David's version of events completely. He'd actually called me after the court decision and said some things that still stung. He'd said I was destroying the family for money, that I was refusing to act like a man should, and that I'd proven I never really loved them. I reached out to him multiple times, emails, phone calls. I tried to explain my perspective without attacking his, but he wouldn't engage. He was convinced that I was the villain, and he wasn't open to any narrative that contradicted that. That hurt more than the lawsuit. One evening, sitting in my apartment, I realized something crucial. I couldn't fix Thomas. I couldn't convince him. I couldn't prove my worth to him through actions or explanations or time. And more importantly, I didn't have to. I'd spent my entire life believing that my value was measured by my utility to others, that if I just tried hard enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough, everyone would eventually understand and love me. But that's not how it works. Some people are so invested in their narrative of victimhood that no amount of truth will change it. Some people see generosity as weakness. Some people resent you more for setting a boundary than they ever would for refusing help in the first place. I had to accept that Thomas might never come back. And as devastating as that was, I realized it was his choice to make. My job wasn't to convince him. My job was to live my life with integrity and peace. Around this time, something unexpected happened. My neighbor, a woman named Linda who lived 2 doors down, started having problems with her roof. A tree had fallen during a storm and damaged the structure. She was terrified about the cost. She was on a fixed income, a widow, and couldn't afford major repairs. I was working on my own deck when she mentioned it, and for the first time, I actually thought about the situation before volunteering. I didn't immediately offer to pay for everything. I didn't sacrifice my entire week to fix it. I didn't enable her to avoid the problem or avoid taking responsibility for her own home. Instead, I offered to help her get 3 quotes from contractors. I helped her understand what she actually needed versus what was optional. I offered to do the labor I was capable of, removing debris, helping with some of the preliminary work. But I made it clear that major structural repairs needed to be handled by professionals and paid for by her. She was initially disappointed that I wasn't just fixing everything, but then something shifted. She realized that this kind of help, the kind that actually empowers rather than enables, meant more than just throwing money at the problem. We ended up becoming genuine friends, real friends. Not friends where one person is perpetually giving and the other is perpetually taking, but friends where there's actual reciprocity. Linda would bring me homemade lasagna. I'd help her with yard work. She'd listen when I talked about the family situation. I'd listen when she talked about missing her husband. It was balanced. It was healthy. It was what real relationships looked like. I started dating again, which terrified me. I hadn't been on a date in years. My entire identity had been wrapped up in being the provider, the problem solver, the martyr of my family. The idea of being vulnerable with a woman felt impossible. But I was also starting to understand that isolation wasn't strength, that being alone wasn't the same as being free. I met Jennifer at the gym. She was a physical therapist, strong, independent, and completely unimpressed by my attempt to fix her life. Our first conversation was about shoulder pain, not about my financial status or my willingness to sacrifice everything for her. Our second conversation was about books. Our third was about travel. She didn't need me to be her savior. She needed me to be her partner. And that was revolutionary for me. 3 months into dating Jennifer, she asked me about my family situation. I told her the whole story, the lawsuit, the betrayals, the estrangement. I expected judgment, or at least pity. Instead, she said something that changed my perspective completely. It sounds like you finally figured out that love isn't the same as self-destruction. That's not cold, that's wisdom. As the months passed after the court victory, I started receiving messages from other people who'd heard about my situation. A cousin reached out to say that she'd been in a similar situation with her own family and had felt completely alone until she heard my story. A friend of a friend asked if I'd consider talking to his son, who was struggling with the same guilt manipulation cycle in his own family. I realized that my experience, painful as it was, had value, not because I'd won against my family, but because I'd demonstrated that you could love people and still have boundaries, that you could be a good man and say no, that you could lose relationships and survive it. I started volunteering at a community center, helping young men navigate family conflict. I didn't position myself as having all the answers, but I shared my experience. I told them about the shame I'd felt, the confusion, the guilt that came from finally setting boundaries. I told them that the guilt would fade, but the peace would remain. One evening, a young man named Marcus came to talk to me after a session. He was about 25, and his family was pressuring him to give them money for a business venture that made no sense. He was terrified of disappointing them, terrified of being labeled the selfish one. "How did you do it?" he asked. "How did you say no to your own family?" I thought about that question carefully. I didn't do it because I didn't love them. I did it because I loved myself enough to stop destroying myself for people who weren't willing to take responsibility for their own lives. That's not cruelty, Marcus. That's survival. He nodded slowly, like something was clicking into place. Months turned into a year after the court victory. Jennifer moved in. James got promoted at work and called to tell me immediately. Rachel got engaged and asked me to walk her down the aisle. Thomas still hadn't reached out, and I'd made peace with that. Some doors close, some relationships end. That's not a failure, that's a natural consequence of incompatible values and broken trust. But the most significant moment came on a random Tuesday evening, about 14 months after the court decision. I received a message from David, not a legal notice, not an angry tirade, just a message that said, "I've been thinking about what the judge said, about the pattern, and I think you were right. I think I took advantage of you. I'm sorry. It wasn't everything. It wasn't Margaret's acknowledgement or Thomas's reconciliation or a return to how things had been before. But it was something real. It was an actual, genuine recognition of wrongdoing. And more importantly, I could receive it without it meaning I had to go back to being used. I didn't respond immediately. I sat with it for a while, genuinely considering what I wanted to say. And what I realized was, I didn't need his apology. I was grateful for it, but I didn't need it to feel complete or whole. I'd already reclaimed my life. I'd already moved forward. His apology was like a postcard from a place I no longer lived. Interesting to receive, but not necessary for my journey. When I finally did respond, I kept it simple. I appreciate that. I hope you're taking better care of yourself now. And I meant it. Not with the desperate hope that everything could go back to how it was, but with the genuine wish that he'd figured out how to live without destroying the people who loved him. 2 years after the court case, I stood in my own home. a place I'd finally made comfortable for myself rather than for guests who would never fully appreciate it, and reflected on everything that had changed, not just in my circumstances, but in who I'd become. The difference was profound. My life had reorganized itself around authenticity rather than obligation. Work was still work, but it was no longer a place where I felt I needed to give more than I received. My boss had actually been surprised when I started saying no to overtime without providing an elaborate justification. He'd responded by respecting my boundaries more, not less. Apparently, people respect you more when you respect yourself. Jennifer and I had gotten engaged on a beach at sunset, not the romantic abandonment of self that my previous relationships had represented, but a genuine partnership where we both showed up fully. She had her own career, her own money, her own life. We weren't completing each other, we were complementing each other. She didn't need me to be her savior, and she didn't ask me to be. She just asked me to be honest, present, and real. That's actually less work than the alternative, I told her once, when she apologized for not needing me to rescue her. Good, she'd laughed, because I'm not interested in being a full-time rescue mission. James and I had rebuilt a relationship that felt like actual friendship. He no longer saw me as just a provider or a problem solver. He saw me as a man, complicated, flawed, but trying. We'd gone hiking together, had actual conversations about life beyond the surface level, and I'd learned to listen to his advice instead of always being the one giving it. Rachel's wedding was beautiful. Walking her down the aisle, I felt a completeness that had nothing to do with money or sacrifice. It had to do with showing up for the people you love without losing yourself in the process. Her new husband, Michael, funny that, pulled me aside at the reception and thanked me for raising a woman who knew how to have healthy boundaries. "She learned from you," he said, "not from what you said, but from what you did. When you stopped letting your family destroy you, you taught her something crucial about self-respect." That hit deep. Thomas still hadn't reached out. I'd made peace with that loss, though it still ached sometimes. I understood now that some people choose their narrative over their relationships. He'd decided that I was the villain in his story, and reconciliation would require changing that narrative. He wasn't ready to do that. Maybe he never would be, and I had to accept that I couldn't control that outcome. But what I could control was my own life, and I was living it better than ever. Margaret had gone completely quiet after the court case. No more lawsuits, no more messages, no more attempts at manipulation. I heard through the grapevine that they'd downsized their lifestyle significantly. David had actually gotten a real job instead of pursuing his endless string of investment opportunities. Whether that was because they'd run out of people to exploit or because they'd genuinely learned something, I didn't know. I didn't spend much energy wondering. The most unexpected change came in my relationship with myself. I started actually enjoying things. I took a photography class because I wanted to, not because anyone needed me to take it. I traveled to Peru for 2 weeks without feeling guilty about abandoning anyone. I spent Saturday mornings reading in coffee shops instead of always being on call to fix something for someone else. I realized that for decades I'd been so focused on being needed that I'd never actually lived my own life. I'd been a character in everyone else's story, never the protagonist of my own. The loneliness I'd feared from setting boundaries turned out to be less lonely than the isolation I'd experienced when surrounded by people who only wanted me for what I could provide. One evening, I was volunteering at the community center again, and Marcus came back. He'd set boundaries with his family. He'd said no to the business venture. There'd been anger and disappointment, but he'd survived it. More than that, he'd thrived. He'd gone back to school, was pursuing his own dreams, and had actually started dating someone who genuinely appreciated him. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for showing me that you could say no and still be a good person. I thought I had to choose between family and self-respect. Turns out I didn't. I just had to choose the right way to say no. As I listened to him, I realized something profound. My pain had become someone else's roadmap. My suffering had meaning beyond myself, and that was better than any of the meaning I'd found in endless self-sacrifice. Years of therapy had taught me that my need to be needed stemmed from deep insecurity. If I was useful, I was safe. If I was giving, I was valuable. If I was sacrificing, I was honorable. But that formula had been broken all along, because real value isn't measured by what you give away. It's measured by who you become in the process of living authentically. Dr. Patterson and I had wound down my therapy sessions about 8 months after the court case. "You don't need me to tell you who you are anymore," she'd said. "You already know." She was right. I did know. I was a man who'd loved too freely, trusted too easily, and sacrificed too much. But I'd also learned the hard way that loving yourself isn't selfish. It's essential. It's the foundation that everything else is built on. On the 2-year anniversary of the court victory, I organized a small dinner at my home. Jennifer, James, Rachel, and her husband, Linda, and a few close friends came. I didn't invite Margaret, David, or Thomas, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. This was a celebration of the people who'd shown up, not a gathering defined by the people who hadn't. As we ate, Jennifer squeezed my hand and said, "I'm proud of you, not for winning the lawsuit, for winning your life back." That was exactly what it was. I hadn't just won a legal battle. I'd won the right to build a life that was actually mine. Not a life built around being a solution to everyone else's problems, but a life built around joy, authenticity, and genuine connection. I thought about the man I'd been 2 years ago, broken, exhausted, carrying the weight of $187,000 in promised obligations that were never mine to begin with. That man was unrecognizable to me now. Not because I'd changed fundamentally, but because I'd finally allowed myself to be who I actually was, underneath all the obligation and guilt and fear. The lesson I'd learned wasn't complicated, but it was crucial. You cannot set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. Eventually the flames will consume you too, and nobody will be saved in the end. You'll just have 2 destroyed people instead of 1. But the moment you refuse the fire, the moment you step back and say, "I love you, but I can't destroy myself for you," something unexpected happens. Some people will hate you for it. They'll call you selfish. They'll claim you've betrayed them. They'll try to punish you. That's real and it hurts. But other people, people with their own integrity, their own ability to take responsibility for their lives, will respect you. They'll understand. They'll actually want to have a deeper relationship with you because you've shown that you're whole enough not to need them to complete you, and you'll get your life back. Standing on my balcony that evening, watching the sunset with Jennifer beside me, I realized that the best part of the story wasn't the courthouse victory. It wasn't winning the lawsuit or getting my legal fees back. The best part was this: peace. Real, solid, unshakable peace that came from knowing I was living according to my values instead of according to someone else's expectations. The pain of the family estrangement hadn't disappeared completely. That would be dishonest. But it had transformed into something manageable, something that didn't define me anymore. I could think about Thomas without drowning in guilt. I could see Margaret's name without my stomach dropping. I could remember the years of financial manipulation without spiraling into shame, because I finally understood their choices were their choices, my choices were mine, and I was finally fully living with the consequences of my own choices, which meant I was finally fully alive. The lawsuit had been the catalyst, but the real victory was the life I'd rebuilt in its aftermath. A life where I was the protagonist instead of the supporting character. A life where my boundaries were as important as my generosity. A life where love didn't mean self-destruction. And that, I realized, was worth every difficult conversation, every awkward family dinner I'd never attend again, every relationship that had to end for me to survive. That was worth it all.